Welcome to episode 9 of the Filmumentary's podcast. This is Jamie Benning speaking to you from southeast London. This time round I speak to Kenneth George Godwin. Kenneth is the author of a book I have here in front of me, the David Lynch Files, Volume 2, Dune, 6 months behind the scenes on one of the biggest science fiction movies ever made. So Ken was there down in Mexico with a cameraman creating a documentary for the film, and it's a very tantalising book, lots of detail about what was going on set, but also a unique perspective of somebody in a situation they didn't necessarily have full control over, and Ken himself admits that he was very inexperienced at the time. Hope you enjoy my chat, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Ken, can you tell me about how you ended up working for David Lynch on Dune there in Mexico? What was the path that led you to that point?
In the summer of 1980, when I first saw Eraserhead, I became really obsessed with it because it had such a visceral impact on me. And I kind of mulled it over for months. And then I finally wrote an essay to try and, sort of formulate why this film had such an effect on me and what it might mean, because it's a fairly obscure sort of film. So I tried to piece together what the images actually were trying to communicate. And I sent that essay to a magazine called Ciné Fantastique, which specialized in genre films. I'd subscribed to it since its first issue back in the early 70s. And the publisher responded saying he thought my essay was really interesting, but it's not the kind of thing they publish, because it was, I guess, had a bit of an academic sort of tone. But what he did, without actually checking with me first, was he sent that essay to David Lynch, because he had been trying to do something about Eraserhead for a couple of years, and Lynch was basically ignoring him. So he sent my essay to say, look, we take your work really seriously. And for whatever reason, Lynch said, okay, I will talk to you about the making of Eraserhead. But you got to hire the guy who wrote this essay to do the article. And I had no journalistic experience other than writing reviews for a student newspaper at university. And the publisher told me, well, write down a list of questions and we'll get our guy in Los Angeles to go and talk to Lynch and ask the questions that you need to ask, which didn't seem very satisfactory. And Lynch said, no, we can't do it that way. So we had to work out a way to get me to Los Angeles. So I actually had to pay my own way down there, but the magazine paid for a hotel room for a week and a car rental. And I got to meet Lynch, had a couple of really lengthy interviews with him. 2 days in a row, we spent 3+ hours together in the afternoon. Basically, yeah, I mean, I had no experience interviewing, so it was essentially long conversations. And then he had given permission to people who worked on the film to also talk to me, because they were very, very protective of him, and nobody would say anything without him giving their okay. So I met a number of people who'd worked on it that week. And when I came back to Winnipeg, I spent the winter transcribing all my interviews and writing the article. And I sent it to Lynch because I had told him that, as you just said at the beginning of this, if I'd said anything in the article that he really didn't want said, I agreed to take it out. And he liked what I'd written. Actually, it was my sister who said to me, well, why don't you ask him for a job? Because he was prepping Dune at the time. And of course I said, well, that's ridiculous. You can't just ask David Lynch for a job. And then I thought about it, and actually I got in touch with him and said, yeah, if there's anything that, with my lack of qualifications that I might be able to do on Dune, I'd really be willing to come down and work on it. And he actually responded very positively. He's a very generous person, and he's actually helped a lot of people over the years. And I was actually one of the beneficiaries of that, because during the next year, that would have been 82, a couple of things came up that were possibly going to work, but they fell through. And then in early 83, when the production was really set and it was going to be in Mexico and dates were in place and so on, this vice president in the promotions department at Universal, they're always jockeying for position, obviously, in the bureaucracy. He pitched this idea of instead of just doing little clips where we send somebody down to record a little bit of stuff and we put together the EPK, he said, why don't we have a video crew on the shoot for the entire duration, doing interviews, shooting behind the scenes, and we could use this for educational purposes. We could do a making of. So this was all very new at the time. It wasn't now it's absolutely standard procedure on any big production, but nobody had actually really done this before. And Lynch's response was, if you're going to stick a video crew on my set, it's got to be people that he approves and is comfortable with. So he said, hire this camera guy from San Francisco, Anatol Patsnowski, who was with him at the AFI, and you got to hire this writer from Canada. And I had absolutely no qualifications at all, no experience, whatever. And they didn't balk. They sent me a ticket. I went to Los Angeles, met Anatol, and we ended up spending several weeks there. We missed the actual beginning of principal photography because the process of putting together all the equipment and so on took longer than it was originally supposed to. We were using a new system that Panasonic had just invented. So they sort of made a deal with Universal that was mutually beneficial because they wanted to get their system out there. It was a sort of rival for a Beta at the time that obviously never actually took off. I think a few years later it just vanished. They used standard VHS cassettes, but they ran at 6 times normal speed. So a 2-hour cassette recorded 20 minutes. So it was higher quality, but back in those days, the tapes were not really great quality. But anyway, we put together this package, and then Anatol and I drove down there in his Jeep, loaded with all our equipment. We went across the border in Arizona, and it was Good Friday. And so we would basically just, because there was a lot of people going back and forth, because it was, a big holiday for, Mexico being a Catholic country and so on. So we had no visas, we had no papers, we just had a Jeep full of all this electronic equipment. And we drove down to Mexico City and set up at the studio. And as you read the book, you sort of know how things went.
Yeah, I mean, I find the book fascinating. For anybody who's listening that hasn't read it, I absolutely recommend it. The David Lynch Files, Volume 2, Dune. And so you arrived at the studios there in Mexico City, and as somebody who's visited Mexico City a number of times, working there myself as well, I kind of know that it's this busy place of hustle and bustle. Every form of life is there. Was that a stressful moment for you to arrive there, knowing that you had this big job ahead of you with very little experience?
Well, stress might be putting it mildly.
Yeah.
I mean, to begin with, just the drive down to Mexico City was pretty hair-raising. I don't know if you've ever been in Mexico and driven in Mexico.
Luckily, I've not driven.
Yeah, narrow roads, large trucks that don't want to go to the edge of the road because they're going to fall into ravines, coming straight at you down the road. So you have to get out of their ways. We lost the count of the number of burned out buses in ravines that we went past. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. And then we actually arrived in Mexico City at about 3 a.m. and didn't really know where we were going. We actually parked and went to get some breakfast. And at one point while we were eating, a group of people started crowding around the Jeep outside. which had all our stuff in it. So we had to kind of run out and scare people away. Drove, eventually found our way to the studio. So we arrived there about 6 a.m. and just sat in the Jeep until people started arriving. So, we were both like, we didn't really know where we were. Neither of us had done anything like this before, and didn't really know how we were going to do it. So, it was, so stress is a kind of a mild way of putting it.
Yeah, not the ideal situation to be in for your first day at work on a job that you didn't know, what it was about at that point. I mean, what was your feeling going in? Did you feel like the documentary was going to be something personal about Lynch himself? Was it to serve Lynch himself, or was it in your mind to kind of show and reveal the making of process itself?
Oh, very definitely the first. Both Anatole and I, because Anatole had been with him at the AFI, so they knew each other. And Anatole was an artist himself. And my interest in Lynch was, it was an interest in him as an artist, a filmmaker. So for us, we wanted to make a film about David Lynch making this thing which was so vastly bigger than anything he'd done. He'd only done Eraserhead and Elephant Man at that point. Yeah. So this was just a massive step up in terms of scale, budget, and so on. So we were interested in how does somebody who's obviously an artist who is really minutely concerned with all the details of the work he's doing, how does he cope with something on that scale? And it wasn't very long before we realized that's not what we had actually been hired to do, that we were essentially assigned to the publicity department on the production. If you look at the cast and crew list, we're subsumed under that, and they were looking for more of the second you were talking about, like just the how is a big movie made kind of thing. So there was some friction and a bit of conflict along the way, and we actually were told, I'm not sure how far into it now, but we were spending a lot of time on set filming Lynch at work, and we were eventually told, spend less time with Lynch, go film the prop department where they're building things, go film. Which, I mean, retroactively, I realized, we should have been doing all this other stuff as well, but it didn't seem like a job because, again, I had no experience, I had no context for what we were doing, and Anatole had never really done anything like this before. So for us, it was just a kind of a fun personal thing we were doing. So we weren't thinking in the sort of corporate terms of the way the people that hired us were looking at it.
Yeah.
So we were told to back off from Lynch and go do all this other stuff.
Despite the fact that your the reason that they'd employed you kind of changed from doing like a personal film about Lynch to something more akin to today what would be called an EPK, I guess, where you would go and shoot particular departments and draw from that. Was there a sense that you were still shooting stuff that in the back of your mind could make another documentary? Because obviously, I'm sure many of the listeners will know that the film, began to unravel a little bit, and Lynch wasn't having a good time. So did you feel kind of in the back of your mind, there could be something else more interesting than what they have in store for us here?
Well, yeah, it's still, I think even when we were told to sort of focus more on the nuts and bolts kind of thing, I think both of us were still continuing to think that our focus was going to be on how Lynch was dealing with the situation. And he was quite happy to have us hanging around the set. I think we were at some point it was almost like we were lucky mascots or something, because it was a connection that he had with his past that whereas I'd say the majority of the people who were working on the film didn't really know who he was. They didn't really know what he'd been doing. Because a huge crew like that, you're hired to do this job. You don't necessarily, look into the guy who's actually directing the film. And in fact, partway through, Lynch held screenings of Eraserhead to sort of this is who I am kind of thing. And wasn't a huge number of people who even bothered to come to those screenings. So, and I think a number of them were kind of baffled by what's this got to do with what we're doing here?
Yeah.
I think one of his biggest interests in what he was doing was the sort of textural design of the four worlds and how they sort of fitted together, and it's like different historical references depending on which of the four cultures that you were dealing with. So he was very, very much involved in how the film looked and so on. And if you just look, well, I mean, Elephant Man is in some ways a fairly conventional narrative film, but Eraserhead obviously isn't. And I think ultimately one of the big problems from a commercial point of view was that his storytelling abilities weren't really up to a narrative that large and dense. So it ended up being too obscure for a big audience.
Yeah, sure. Of course there were tensions on set. Was there much? Was Dino De Laurentiis in Lynch's ear a lot during the shooting? I know that obviously the presence of Raffaella there became an issue, but how much control were they trying to, or how much control were they trying to take away from Lynch? Did you get a sense of that?
Well, Dino actually only visited a couple of times during the shoot. I think he was leaving it up to Raffaella, and it was actually it was one of her first big solo jobs. It was one of those weird things that sometimes happens with big productions where they had hired Lynch because of his not being a mainstream sort of thing, but being a more quirky artist kind of person with a personal vision, if you want to put it that way. Yeah. But they were also making this massive, which they obviously hoped would be the next Star Wars.
Yeah, sure.
Commercial project for a very commercially minded studio. I mean, Universal is generally noted for art. And so there was a real tension between the art and the commerce. And so, yes, we brought him in to add something to this film that we're making, but we can't let him dominate it too much because we have to have the commercial return eventually. So it sort of moved back and forth a bit. And I think, I wasn't privy to a lot of the higher end sort of stuff, yes. But I'm sure there were tensions which increased as the summer went on between Lynch and Raffaella, simply because things were it didn't really go over schedule, but you could feel this kind of slow heaviness about the production. Yeah. And, the people in charge were, we got to get this done. And of course, Lynch spent 4.5 years making Eraserhead, sort of refining every detail and rethinking everything as he was going along. And you couldn't possibly do that on a film this scale. So it was just one of those odd things that somebody had thought was a good idea at some point, but ultimately maybe wasn't the best idea.
Yeah, because David Lynch is a very distinctive director with a particular artistic integrity, I guess you could call it, which is very important to him. And it sort of, from the outside looking in, it just feels like he wasn't given the room to be able to do that with Dune. It still has his stamp on it, that film, of course, but you know, you look back retrospectively over his catalogue now, and it really doesn't fit with what we know from David Lynch. And I do wonder what was in their mind when they decided to hire him. I mean, of course, you mentioned, you know, they're wanting it to be the next Star Wars in a way for Universal, and many studios were looking for that sort of, you know, the key ingredients for that. And of course, he was offered a Star Wars film, wasn't he, David? Return of the Jedi. Yes,
Return of the Jedi.
Goodness knows what would have happened if he'd have made that. Maybe it would have been a better film, let's say.
I don't know that anybody could say that, but yeah. No, but I still think that Dune was actually very important for his career, as awful as his experience was for him. And, you know, he didn't talk about it for years. And I went to a thing that he was involved in, I think it was 2002, 2003, which was a transcendental meditation-based weekend down in Ohio, I think, Iowa. And when he was introduced at the beginning of the weekend, because he was the, you know, sort of the main host of the event, and the person introducing him listed off his filmography, everything was mentioned except Dune. So it was obvious that he had, like, I want nothing to do with that. I think he's mellowed a bit since. I don't know if you've read his autobiography that came out last year.
It's on my reading list right now, yeah. I've been recommended it by several people recently. I didn't even know it existed, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book. But there's a whole chapter on Dune, which really surprised me. And he is fairly introspective about what happened, what went wrong, why it didn't work, and so on. But of course, it was because he did Dune, and it was, you know, such a problematic thing that Dino gave him $6 million to make Blue Velvet, which was a script he had been working on for some years. And that's the film that sort of artistically and commercially created who we know David Lynch to be now. So that might never have happened if he hadn't gone through the Dune thing and seen that way of making movies. And so everything else he's done since, you know, they're all fairly low budget films, but they're all totally controlled by him. And, he's been pretty successful, obviously. So Dune, as, you know, it might objectively be, a bit of a disaster, but I think it is a key element in his development as a filmmaker. It's the one that moved him out of being I was going to say sort of more self-consciously artistic, but I mean his later films are actually very self-consciously artistic. But he managed to absorb something about how to make something which would appeal more to a larger audience through the Dune experience.
Yeah, it served a purpose, didn't it, and pushed him perhaps back to what he was always destined to do.
Oh yes,
yeah. I think we've all had experiences like that in our life where we realise, oh no, that wasn't a great experience, but I now know what I don't want to do.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So it's very valuable in itself, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it totally kept him out of becoming a sort of mainstream Hollywood filmmaker.
One thing we should say, and I don't think it's any spoiler because I think you mentioned it relatively early on in the book, is of course that you never got to make the documentary that you shot because the footage is supposedly no longer in any archive anywhere. It was destroyed. That must have been a pretty hard hit to take as somebody who'd spent so much time there and had shot so much stuff and had been through quite an experience yourself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we had actually tried, we were there for 6 full months. It was a 25-week shoot. And we shot somewhere around 75 hours of material. And we tried all that summer to sort of formalize our position because, I mean, we were hired, but nothing was ever, there was no contract, there was nothing signed. And we were verbally assured that at the end of principal photography, we and all the material would go back to Los Angeles, where we would make this, making of documentary, like a 1 hour or something like that. And right at the end of the shoot, we just got a directive from Universal saying, pack up all the equipment and tapes, send it back to Los Angeles, and goodbye. And so, yeah. So that was frustrating because we had both pretty much figured that we would be in, another, maybe 6 months on this project, but that didn't happen. And over the years, I tried various ways of making contacts inside Universal to find out what what had happened, where did the material still exist? And it was only I guess it was almost 10 years ago now, when I set up my website, which I put a lot of this David Lynch stuff on my website at that time. And I got an email from a guy in France who did DVD extras, and he had worked on the French release.
Jerome
Wybon, yeah. And he had worked on their Dune release, and he said he had gone looking for this stuff when he was working on that project, and had heard directly from Paul Salmon, who was one of the publicists on Dune, that Salmon had actually a year or two after the shoot had tried to find this material, and he was told that, nah, the movie bombed, so we just ditched it. Yeah, which I know. This is a long time ago, but it still infuriates me.
Yeah, I bet.
Like how short-sighted.
Up again, because it's kind of infuriates me as a movie lover and as a lover of behind the scenes documentaries, and I love the sort of time capsule part of it, that you were there capturing this kind of seminal film. That potentially is lost forever. I still hold out a little bit of hope, because we hear those stories like, when Charles de Lauzirika went and did the Blade Runner Final Cut, and they found all of the elements sitting on pallets in archives about to be destroyed, and nobody knew they were there, and there were so many unmarked reels of film, and who knows, one day we might hear that, oh no, I had that in my I've had that in my drawer for years, or it's it could be anywhere. Let's face it.
Well, I try not to hold on to that hope, because I think you'll go insane after a while.
Yeah.
But I harbored this fantasy for the longest time that the tapes did still exist, and Lynch might have a slightly better attitude towards it, and then we could maybe do a Hearts of Darkness where you interview Lynch and people now looking back on the experience, and then fill that out with all this material that was actually shot at the time.
Yeah, because that's the thing with retrospectives, is that people have got their kind of rehearsed stories over the years, haven't they? And it doesn't necessarily truly reflect what happened at the time, whereas you were there shooting it, and there's no way of, that kind of cheating us. I love the Sean Young stuff that she released a few years back.
That's super great
8mm footage. It's fantastic to see, and I immediately messaged her and said, "Is there more of this?" And I think she immediately unfollowed me at that point, because she's probably been bombarded by another huge amount of people like me asking that question. But I do find that footage so tantalising. So. Yeah, I can understand why it must be really difficult to hold on to any hope that that yours exists out there.
So because of the our inexperience and our conflicted feelings about what exactly we were doing there, I think even though we had 75 hours, it would probably be difficult to put together just a straightforward the making of Dune. Because I don't think we covered things we should have covered, or we didn't, we covered an aspect of something, but we didn't get the other side of it. So you can't really put together a more complete picture of something, because we were having fun hanging out on set and watching David Lynch do his thing.
Yeah, because you got to interview quite a lot of the main players there. And one of the, I guess one of the sad things in your book is, your relationship with Jack Nance, and sad because he was clearly in some decline with his alcoholism, and was ultimately replaced. I think that's fascinating insight into what was going on there, and just the fractious and difficult nature of being on a shoot in a foreign country, in all that heat with all of those issues going on, and then you really bring it down to the personal level. And I think that's I think that's a fantastic part of your book.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I've always been a bit wary of, like, when I decided to put it out, that this is just me kind of whining about my condition down there. And for somebody who wants to know about the making of Dune, I'm not sure it actually gives you the sort of detail and the anecdotes that people are used to. And so it sort of makes me, obviously it's my journal, so I'm sort of the center of this thing while this whole thing is going on around me. And I was always like, who's going to be interested in that? But I've been actually getting some fairly positive feedback on it, so that's gratifying.
Yeah, no, it really is an interesting insight. And as you say, even though it kind of revolves around you, all that stuff going on in the periphery, just the struggle that you're going through and the uncertainty of everything, I think is really well communicated by you in your writing. So, yeah, thanks for that. Because it was a book that I saw somebody had said they were reading it, and I just saw a post on Twitter, and I was like, why did I not know about this? I only read it in the last 6 or 8 months, and then read it again during the lockdown here in the UK, and it's become a book that I've become more and more fascinated with each time I've looked through it, and I wish I wish I had it in ebook form, because I want to search out certain bits, but I believe we can. It is available
as an
hardback
ebook,
and paperback, and
and obviously I've completely lucked out, because I actually, like, I originally put this on my website like 10 years ago, and then 4 years ago, I created my own, self-published ebooks, which, were on Amazon or whatever, and, not getting much notice. But a friend put me in touch with Bear Manor Media just late last year, and I contacted Ben Omart there, and because the books were, they were pretty well ready to go. He said, sure, because, they do print on demand, so it's not really a huge investment on their part. And so, the books came out at the beginning of March, and that's when the publicity for Denis Villeneuve's remake is really ramping up. And because of the remake, people are looking back at Lynch's film, and there's some reevaluation going on about that. So my book, purely by chance, dropped into the middle of all that, and as you said, it's been showing up on Twitter, and I've been getting a few fairly positive reviews. So the timing was totally accidental, but couldn't have been better.
I think it's quite an exciting prospect with Denis Villeneuve shooting the new one, and of course there's a release coming out of Dune again on Blu-ray. I think Arrow Films are working on that one.
Yeah, they're doing the 4K Ultra HD.
Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it? There's still this hunger for it, because it's such an interesting book. I read it as a kid a couple of times, and it was the first time I realised, this came from someone's head. How could they create this world that's so big and so vast and so detailed, where you have to check the glossary every 5 minutes to work out what they're talking about? It's just, wow, somebody's created this. One of the questions, I suppose, is a bit of a cheeky question, really, Ken, but how would you have done things differently now, knowing what you know now?
Oh, God. Well, I think I would have really pressed for like a formal agreement with Universal about what we were actually doing. And I think I would be much more systematic about what we did while we were down there. It took me a couple of months to sort of realize what we should be doing if we were going to create some, not necessarily narrative, but something coherent out of what was going on. And I had a lot of conflicts with Anatole about that because I would say, we really have to go shoot this because it connects to this. And he said, I don't really want to shoot that. I'd rather be doing this. So I think at the start, you need to have some sort of framework that you're going to pull everything into. I've made documentaries myself since then, so I have a somewhat better idea of what I'm doing. I became a documentary editor about a bit more than a decade after my Dune experience. So I have a better sense of you have to understand why you're shooting the thing you're shooting right now. And I don't think we really did. We were just oh shucks, this is amazing. Let's just go look at this.
And how do you think the behind the scenes content has changed since your work on Dune?
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of really good films made about the making of films, but there's also an awful lot of very formulaic stuff. Yes. Where the interviews, everybody's got their pat comment about, oh, it's so great working with this person or that person. And it's just so bland. And I think it sort of became too routine. So we were at the other end when it hadn't been done. So we were trying to figure out what to do. And then as that approach was developed, I think there was more of a willingness to to show all the warts and all the little conflicts and whatnot. But I think a lot of that's been smoothed out since then. So it's I find a lot of Blu-ray extras just so bland that they're not actually even worth watching anymore.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because they're so tied to the marketing department.
Exactly.
That it's very difficult to get true representation of what it's like behind the scenes without the studio having their fingers in that pie and and ruining the ingredients there. But you can't be independent, can you?
No, and obviously the people who are funding those behind the scenes things don't want anything to sort of cast doubt on the film that they're about. So you kind of want to cover up if there are conflicts or difficulties or so they're just part of the huge marketing system now.
I think in some ways for me that I'm not overly interested in behind the scenes stuff of new movies. I'm more interested when a certain amount of time has passed, 20, 30, 40 years. I've done some of my own stuff on the Star Wars movies and Jaws and Indiana Jones, because I think enough time has passed to not kind of spoil the magic of the movie. We've had those movies all, for a big proportion of our life. And also we have the opportunity to talk to the people who are no longer invested in that movie in the same way that they were at the time. I was chatting to Charles de Lauzarigue, who did a lot of Ridley Scott stuff recently, and he was saying you want to get people either just before they're shooting it or way after they've shot it, because otherwise you get into this area where they're either on set and they're kind of unsure about what the film is yet, or they're in the press junkets afterwards when they're just reeling out the same old crap every day in, day out for months.
Yeah.
So I do like the idea of a retrospective, and who knows, one day there might be room to do it on Dune. But I guess it would rely on the fact of somebody digging up this footage in some way. But I'm not going to bring that up again because I know it's hard to think about.
Yeah.
What was the draw then to those studios at that particular time? Was it a tax break issue, or was it something to do with size? Or
well, it's a very big studio, so they had the room, and it was in Mexico, so relatively speaking, incredibly cheap. And the Mexican craftspeople were enormously skilled. So you can even see it in the finished film, just the detail, the textures of everything. The sets were just remarkable to be on because they felt like real spaces. Like the Great Hall on Arrakis actually had mosaic floors. They weren't like printed and rolled out. They made mosaic floors. So
Wow.
that kind of detail, because again, the labor was so cheap and very skilled. So yeah, and the exchange rate with the peso was just ridiculous at the time. So, because they when I first interviewed Lynch when I was in Los Angeles doing the Eraserhead thing, one of the possibilities that they were looking at that time was to shoot at studios in England and then do some desert location in Tunisia. And you can imagine how much bigger the budget would need to be to do that. So I think because the facilities were available and just the human resources were available, absolutely, they got way more for their budget than they could have anywhere else. But even then, they were trying to squeeze the budget for, that's why Dykstra and Apogee left partway through the production, because they kept squeezing the effects budget, and he finally decided, I can't do good work at this, for this cost. So they brought in other effects people. I don't know if I should be saying that, but
I mean, bold move really by Dykstra, but an honest one at least. And yeah, it's so difficult with everything where the budget's being squeezed, because you just feel like you're being compromised at every turn, and you get to a point where you just don't want to be associated with the film. And of course, David had his name removed from the TV cut of the film.
Oh God, that was an abomination.
Yeah. How to make a bad situation worse, that felt like.
I know. I was so when I heard that there was a 3-hour television thing, I thought, oh wow, then maybe they put back some of the crucial stuff that they took out of the theatrical version, which to me was incredibly damaging. The stuff that they removed, and no, they put some of it back, but they didn't do it properly, and it was just it was awful. And I guess there's never going to be an opportunity for a director's cut. So
No,
we're stuck with what's there. And I actually really like the movie. I can see all its flaws, all the both in terms of conception and the final sort of mutilation of it. I'm totally aware of all that stuff, but I can't think of very many other movies that so completely create like an imaginary world in such detail. And that's what I like about it is you just feel like you're in this place that exists nowhere except here.
it really does feel like it was shot on another planet.
Exactly.
I mean, as you say, those sets you mentioned and the artistry involved, you can see it in every single frame, particularly in the Blu-ray release.
Yeah,
I was astounded, but I was used to having a off-tube copy from Channel 4 here in the UK in the late 80s, early 90s, and when I saw it in Blu-ray, just kind of blown away, because it really does stand up. Yeah. So after all of that happened, then, Ken, what did you go on to do? What was your career path after that? You mentioned that you worked on documentaries.
Yeah, well, that took a while to get to. I actually took a year off after, because I earned enough on Dune to, I went back to England, and I toured around Europe for the summer and so on. And while I was there, I wrote a script specifically for Jack Nance, because we'd become friends. So I based the character on him, and we tried to get that going. And there's a little epilogue in the book describing the weird experience we had trying to get that going. And then I just worked various sort of mundane jobs in the 80s, and it was 1989, I think. I went on staff at the Winnipeg Film Group, which is the filmmaker co-op here in Winnipeg. And I became the training coordinator there for a couple of years. And So I a little more, and I started making short films of my own, which I had never actually done before, in 16 millimeter. And it was actually doing the short film, my first short film, that I realized that of the entire process of making a movie, my favorite part was the editing. I just loved putting stuff together on a Steambeck and making things work. And so I started editing other members' short films because a lot of people don't like editing; they like doing the other stuff. So as soon as it became apparent that here's this guy who's reasonably good at this, and so I did that sort of stuff. And I went back to England, and while I was there, I heard about a course in Avid that was being put on at Pinewood by I can't remember the exact name of the trade organization that was doing it. So it was a 3-day intensive workshop. And I actually had almost a visceral dislike of the idea of digital editing because I liked the film strips and all this kind of stuff. But I thought, well, I should at least know how to do it. So I signed up for that. And at the end of the 3 days, I just loved working on the Avid. And when I came back to Winnipeg, because I'd had that training, and it was still fairly new then, I was one of the few people here who actually, could operate the machine. And I was hired to edit a TV half-hour drama by Guy Maddin, which is a terrible film. It was just awful. But I knew Guy casually, and I knew the producer of that half hour who I'd worked with at the film group. And so I did it really cheap just to, get that experience of cutting a drama.
Yeah.
And then we had a National Film Board office here. I don't know how familiar you are with the National Film Board. It's been around since the 40s, and mostly documentary focus. And I just went down to their office to chat with them. They had recently bought Avid, and they were just starting up on a project. And so I was hired for a few weeks to digitize material and just do the sort of grunt work as that project was getting going. And I'd been there only maybe 3 weeks when the original editor got a movie of the week, and she just bailed and went to cut that. And so I'm in the room, and the director, who kind of fancied himself as I can do anything sort of thing, told them to just keep me on, and I could operate the machine while he did the editing. And I ended up editing a 1-hour documentary again. It was like the whole Dune thing. I had no experience with this stuff. I didn't, and I ended up doing some interviews for the documentary. We went down to the States to shoot some interviews, and because by that point, I think I'd shown that I sort of know how things go together, and we were filling in gaps in the thing. So I sort of knew exactly what we needed from these interviews. So I got to do that. We finished that. And then for the next almost 15 years, on and off, I was doing contracts at the National Film Board, cutting feature documentaries, 1 hours. I had 2 years where I was working on a documentary TV series. Like I cut 26 or 28 half hours for that. And so I had a very good editing career for about 15 years. And then the National Film Board basically collapsed here in Winnipeg, and I'd never made like wider connections with the commercial producers around town, and they all had their their standard editors, go-to editors. So my editing career kind of died around 2009, 2010. And so I made a couple of documentaries of my own. I got a little bit of funding and made my own movies. And now I have like a regular day job. I work for the government. And I occasionally do a little bit for friends. I cut a friend's music video a year or so ago. And, some friends who needed some promotional stuff for their business or something. So it's just a little side thing that I occasionally do. But so it was
still all relates back to to that time on Dune in many ways, I suppose, that, just knowing not how to do it in some ways as a learning experience. And I find the book really brave and generous. It's a real gift for people to kind of dive into and look at what can and will go wrong in certain situations and
not worry about being a complete failure.
Yeah, I think I genuinely think it's fascinating, and you've clearly gone on to have an interesting career beyond that. But I think there's just this really fascinating kind of microcosm, a little world that you're drawn into in the book. Where can people find the book, and do you have a website that people could visit to find out more about you?
Oh yeah, I do have a website, which is kgfilms.com, CAGEY films, which was my little company I made to do my own work. So that has links to where you can get the book, where you can see my documentaries, which are free on Vimeo, and it also has my blog, which I've been writing religiously for 10 years now. I've well over 1 million words on my website. Every week I'm posting once or twice about like essays and reviews of movies. The book itself, because it is a print on demand, you won't find it in bookstores. It can be ordered directly from Bear Manor Media or Amazon.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for coming on and sharing, that story of that part of your life with us. It's one that I found absolutely fascinating, and just really wanted to be able to pass it on to anybody. And I hope people do dive in and pick the book up, because I'm a huge fan, as I said, of behind the scenes stuff, and it's a perspective that I'd not really seen before. So thank you for putting it out there in the world.
No, I appreciate the interest. I'm just a little surprised at the response I have gotten so far for that, because as I said, I never really imagined it would be interesting to anybody. And it got published as a companion for my book about Eraserhead. So it was almost an afterthought, but actually because of the current situation with the remake and so on, that's actually the book that's getting more attention.
Thank you, Ken.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate talking to you.
Hope you enjoyed my chat with Ken there. What a nice guy. We had a really good chat, actually. Again, went on for a short time after we finished recording. It really is an interesting book. Do try and pick it up. Ken gave you the details there. KG Films. So for next time, I've got a couple of guests lined up. We'll see which one works out first. But both are quite exciting. Looking forward to it. And the next episode will be episode 10. Can't quite believe it. Thanks for your support as always. Do find me on patreon.com/Jamie Benning, filmumentaries.com, @JamieSWB on Twitter, also on Instagram. And there's a Filmumentaries Facebook group as well. And do share the podcast. I'm doing this for fun and for a hobby, but I really do hope this can get out to more people. So please do share where and when you can. Thanks very much, and I hope you can join me next time on the Filmumentaries podcast.